We're now going to turn to a transition and discussion about how our natural resource exports can be a product of choice on the international market for consumers and countries looking to use low carbon intensive and innovative inputs into the products and to the society that they build. This conversation is going to reflect some of the work that the Business Council over the last 4 years has been doing in partnership with the province of BC to advance British Columbia's low carbon advantage. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Alexa Young is the Vice President, Government Relations and Public Affairs with the BC Council of Forest Industries. Alexa, I've known for a long time. She is a rock star. She has extensive career experience in government and stakeholder relations in both the natural resources and telecommunication sectors. And she's incredibly thoughtful in her approach to connecting the opportunities and value of British Columbia's natural resources to communities, individuals, and Indigenous partners across the province. Dave Slater is the Vice President, External and Indigenous Relations at Fortis BC. Sorry, Doug Slater. Doug, too, is in this band of rock stars in the session that we've assembled today. He has a broad background in labor and human resources and regulatory affairs and natural resources. He's driving Fortis BC's work to become a partner of choice in British Columbia's low carbon energy future in a myriad of different ways that touch us daily as we turn up the thermostat or think about how we move goods through shipping. Dave Nikolejsin is the Vice President of Corporate Development with the Brian Fair Group and a former Deputy Minister with the province of British Columbia, his last posting in energy, mines, and innovation. Dave is an informed and passionate global leader in ESG, having worked extensively with governments, industry, Indigenous nations, and environmental organizations here in BC and Canada and around the world, bringing to fruition some of the most exciting projects in our province. Dave is also a technology expert, among other things, and has been advancing increased linkages between industry and the use of data and increasingly digital economy to achieve and verify ESG objectives, particularly in the energy sector. And lastly, our moderator today is Kim Henderson. In keeping with our theme, Kim's been the leader of many great bands to keep rock stars focused and make sure that we get the outcomes that they want on stage. And she continues to perform at that high level nationally, making a difference on informing what we need to do to accelerate Canada's talent opportunity in ESG in a carbon-constrained world. Kim's the former Deputy Minister of Finance, as well as the Deputy Minister of the Premier of British Columbia, and has served on the Premier of Alberta's Export Panel on Finance. She's a fellow of the Public Policy Forum, where she's leading a national program and discussion as we speak to advance Canada's low-carbon export and energy advantage, having done pioneer work with the Business Council on verifying and advancing our province's low-carbon advantage. This is going to be a great panel, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation, Kim, and I'm going to turn it over to you to lead it. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Greg. Well, it's quite the introduction of the panel of rock stars, but I will commit to folks that none of us will break into song, because I think that would be a bad outcome. As Greg mentioned, in work the Business Council of BC's led for the last several years, a low carbon advantage can be an important economic and ESG pathway for both BC and for Canada. We have the unique opportunity to punch well above our weight to reduce greenhouse gas emissions around the world as a supplier of choice. This in turn can create new jobs, drive innovation and personal prosperity here in BC, and we can do this through the export of our low carbon products. The research that Greg mentioned that we did together with the province in 2019 that was validated by MNP verified that on average, BC's major commodity exports have about half the GHG intensity of identical goods produced by our competitors. If Canada can become the global market's low carbon supplier of choice for vital commodities, we can fight climate change and at the same time create more high paying jobs for Canadians that provide us with an enviable standard of living and jobs that our export sectors create and advance Indigenous economic opportunities and stewardship. Previous sessions in this series have shown investors are paying attention to those businesses serious about our low carbon products. Competitors, customers, and capital are driving business towards lower emitting tech and processes. It may not be a given that global demand will be met by those jurisdictions producing at the lowest cost and at higher GHGs. but that increasingly markets will see value in the lower carbon products. But to be successful, we have some barriers to overcome first. Do the right conditions exist for companies here to decarbonize and be successful in a global marketplace? What are the low carbon opportunities for BC businesses? How are we leading today, and what local innovations are positioning us to lead in the future? And how can we contribute to the global fight against climate change? And my panel here today is going to answer all of those questions for you. And we're going to turn it over to Doug to kick us off. Fortis is the provider of low carbon BC gas, electricity, transportation fuels, including LNG bunkering to the marine sector. How important is it for British Columbians to have access to a broad selection of low carbon energy solutions? And why don't we just jump to zero emission fuels like green hydrogen?
Thank you, Kim. I think we heard a little bit of the same theme on the previous panel. So I guess I'd start to answer that question by saying that there really is no silver bullet to climate change. If there was, we'd probably be talking about something else up here today. And so in reality, it's a challenging problem and it requires a broad range of solutions, particularly in the energy space. We all probably read the IEA's net zero scenario report that was published earlier this year that really demonstrates that an approach to climate change that utilizes a broad range of solutions, including green hydrogen, is needed. And at Fortis BC, we're doing just that. So we're investing in infrastructure across a broad array of climate solutions to provide options and alternatives across a number of sectors. So, give you a few examples. Renewable gas, in that space, we're actively scaling up our supply of renewable and low carbon gases. So that includes investment in renewable natural gas and green hydrogen, for example, as well as other low carbon gases. And we think that renewable gas will play an important role in decarbonizing the energy we deliver to our customers. So, it allows us to make the best use of our infrastructure we already have in BC by replacing what goes into the pipe and what's delivered to customers. In that sort of scale up phase, we're on track to exceed Clean BC's 15% renewable content target before 2030, which really opens the door for us to do a lot more in that space. But that's not the only area. We're investing to the tune of $100 million a year in energy efficiency and conservation to help customers use less energy. So that demand side and reducing, decarbonizing demand is really part of that. But it also, as you mentioned in your question, LNG for marine fueling is another area where we're expanding. So, there we're looking to, expand infrastructure to support the marine shipping industry with low carbon fueling options using LNG. So today we're providing, some truck to ship bunkering. We're looking to go to ship to ship bunkering and allow a broader array of vessels to benefit from the low carbon intensity LNG that we have here in BC and benefit from those both locally here and globally. So I would say, really, to sum up the question, the transition, particularly in the energy sector, is about putting a lot of tools on the table. So green hydrogen is a good one, but there are many more. And I guess I'd add that it's a bit early to and risky to place all our bets on a single solution at this stage, and that's really being recognized in globally in these reports as we look to decarbonize and start to really tackle that challenge.
Thanks, Doug. There's a lot of threads to pull there that I'm sure we're going to get into as we get into some more questions. Alexa, how is BC's forestry sector innovating to compete in a global marketplace? And what is your sector's low carbon advantage relative to other jurisdictions?
Thanks, Kim, and good morning to everyone. Really happy to be joining you virtually today from the traditional territory of the Coast Salish people. For those of you, first and foremost, who don't know COPE, a quick 101, we represent the majority of BC's forest product companies. So companies big and small, making everything from lumber and shakes and shingles to pellet and paper packaging. This panel, and Kim, your question couldn't be more timely. The pandemic and discussions around global economic recovery haven't slowed down. Expectations with respect to climate action, we're seeing more and more consumers demanding products that are good for the planet. We're seeing more and more investors wanting to put their dollars behind companies that are walking the talk on ESG. We're both managing climate risk and creating value on the solution side. We're seeing governments, including our biggest trading partners, looking to progress their own net zero commitments. We've talked about that today, and they're taking action through regulation, through policy, and even how they're making procurement decisions, including on things like public infrastructure. China's committed to carbon neutral by 2060. Biden's introduced a $2 trillion green infrastructure program. That's going to require lots of inputs, including construction materials. And where domestic producers can't meet demand, like we've historically seen with lumber, the right partner of choice is going to have to step in and fill those gaps. So here's where the good news is. On all those fronts, BC's forest sector can and should be that partner of choice. And that's for a whole bunch of different reasons and on a whole bunch of different levels, starting with, we've got the renewable low carbon products the world's looking for. The paper packaging that the takeout from your favorite restaurant came in last night is reducing the use of single-use plastics. This table, this chair, the tall wood building down the street, they're all storing carbon for their lifetime, and the market's responding to that. In construction, we're seeing changes in the industry and to building codes in the US, China, South Korea to meet that growing demand. And it's not just wood products. You just heard a really exciting stuff from Alan Nicol from Canfor. Lots of BC forest product companies are also in the bioenergy business, taking biomass and wood residues from sawmilling and other manufacturing processes and turning that into pellets and biofuels. They're using that to power their own manufacturing facilities and reduce emissions and diversify and grow new commercial opportunities. Talk about a circular economy. So we've got a really good story to tell, but back to your question, why is a forest product made in BC better than a forest product made elsewhere? And this is where the low carbon advantage comes in. Yes, BC is a leader in producing products with the lower carbon intensity than other places because of our clean electricity grid. We talked about that today. And yes, the BC industry's invested heavily to further decarbonize. It's reduced its emissions by 40% between 2007 and 2017. And that's something that we should be proud of. But what we don't talk enough about is the role that sustainably managed forests play in taking our low carbon advantage to the next level as the world continues to turn to renewable forest products, climate smart forestry. The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change could not have been clearer. Doing this well, making sure the carbon storage potential of forests and forest products is maximized is key to the solution set. And this is where we've got the advantage once again. BC's already a leader. We've got strict regulations and amazing registered forest professionals taking care of our forests every day. It's why BC is a leader in conservation with over 52% of the land base either protected or under some form of conservation designation. It's why we only harvest 1% of the forested area where harvesting is allowed each year. And it's why we've got 50 million hectares of forest certified to international standards. This is globally leading stuff. So while we absolutely recognize we're not perfect and there's always more work to do, ultimately what we're talking about here is win-win-wins. We've got the renewable low carbon product, the people, we've got the know-how, and the what's next really has to be about how we maximize the opportunity.
Thanks, Alexa. There's a lot to be proud of there for sure. And we certainly know from the work that BCBC led with the province on the low carbon advantage that many sectors have that pride to share in. I'm going to give Dave an opening question. Dave and I are longtime colleagues. Dave, what's the global market outlook for BC low carbon products and specifically LNG, which I know is near and dear to your heart? And what's the opportunity for us to market ourselves to help realize the opportunity?
Thanks, Kim, and hi, everyone. Yeah, I'll break it down into three quick parts. You know, what's going on out there in the world around demand, what's happening around the low carbon side of that, and then should or could BC be in the game? So on the global perspective around demand, the one thing I always like to talk about, demand is demand. And what we're doing here around our supply decisions or our protests or anything we're doing here is not affecting global demand. It is debatable what demand is going to be, and it's fun to debate. Is it going, south? Is it going north? When will the curve tip over? Facts are that global demand is growing, and every credible scenario shows a role for gas. It's debatable again how big that role is going to be over what time, but no credible scenario or person is saying it's going to zero anytime soon. Gas will be a transition fuel, and that does not neuter what's happening in renewables in the renewable space. It's an amazing story what's happening in the growth of renewables. And in fact, gas is finding a pretty important niche in firming up renewables and being that key base load, go-to generation source that's way better than coal. And we're seeing that play out in Europe right now, in China and elsewhere. The thing that's interesting to watch is, price and what's happening globally right now because of those shortages of gas everywhere. LNG is, touching $30 right now. And just for perspective, for those that don't know how big a number that is, most projects in the world will go somewhere between $8 and $12, makes every project look smart. At the bottom of the COVID crisis, it bottomed out at $2, that industry, and it's now $30 and going north. That sounds great if you're in the LNG game, right? Well, not really, actually. It's fun in the short term, but what that's doing is it's causing international action to curtail activity in LNG importation spaces. So you're seeing projects being put on hold or cargoes being deferred because people just can't afford it. At $30 LNG, you can't afford it. And so that's a big problem for the LNG industry. And what's happening because of that? Guess what? Coal, a resurgence of coal and coal plants. Just this week, China announced, they instructed their banks to give favorable money to their coal industry, mining and generation, because they don't want to run out of energy. Because the next step, if you run out of coal, is you start to curtail your industries. And nobody's going there, or nobody wants to go there. But I'll tell you, there's some economies who have rushed headlong into renewables too quickly without the idea around baseload generation, who are going to be in deep trouble if it gets cold this winter. And so that's reality. So what has to happen, so we don't end up on that slippery slope, back to where we came from, is to think about the role of LNG as a transition fuel, and partner with the environmental community to support the heck out of renewables. But let's not go backwards, and let's talk about the transition and the role of gas. The low carbon part of it's a huge story. Not all LNG and not all gas is created equal. One of the things we're most proud of in BC is our regulatory space has driven, LNG Canada to be the cleanest project out there right now. And wood fiber and the other ones that are out there, same story. So that matters, because if you're watching the marketplace, responsible customers are demanding net zero LNG cargoes now. So industry's out there looking for offsets everywhere to offset the emissions intensity of LNG being delivered into these marketplaces, so that the generation guys and the customer side can say it's net zero. So that's where it's going, and that takes us to BC and should we be in the game? So remembering, demand is demand. The only question we're debating is, should BC be in the supply side? And I look at what our opportunities are, and it's amazing, actually, and how we can take things that have historically been a drag on us being in the game, which is we're a high cost jurisdiction. Well, why are we high cost? It's because we give a damn. Like, we actually care about our water and how we treat our environment and how we treat our Indigenous peoples and our emissions. We care about our emissions targets. That's been historically made us a high cost jurisdiction. Well, that is what ESG is about. So how do we take those things that have historically been a drag, turn them into benefits, and then get on with things? Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. Full of passion as always. And I hope that that's what everybody remembers as we go through this panel. Demand is demand. And the question is will BC and Canada be the supplier? There's something I wanted all of you to speak to, and Doug, maybe we'll have you, we'll take it first. So technology and innovation play an important role, obviously, in addressing climate change and getting to net zero. What more is it that we need to be doing?
Yeah, good question. I agree completely. Like, reaching net zero is going to require rapid deployment of new technologies, and across a lot of different areas. One of the things that kind of jumped out at me, and I go back to the IEA report there, is that more than half of the emissions reductions to get to net zero are based on technologies that are still in the demonstration and pilot stage. And when you look at the heavy duty and long distance transport sector, that number is even higher than 50%. So, I think that just really underscores how much we have to put innovation and technology development to the forefront. We simply can't get there without advances in technology. And so on the space of what more needs to be done is that, as I talked about earlier, we have to work hard to get as many tools on the table as possible. And so, for example, that is, a role of government to support investment in innovation and technology, but also of, utilities, customers, and industry. And so one of the things we're doing at Fortis BC is we have a Clean Growth Innovation Fund. The purpose of that fund is to accelerate the adoption of new technologies. And we're investing in everything from renewable gases to hydrogen to carbon capture and other end-use technologies. And I think it's those actions and the a lot of what we're doing is also co-supported by governments, whether federal or provincial, also investing in grant funding to support these technologies. So on the question of what more do we need to be doing is, we have to invest in this area, plain and simple. And we have to recognize that not all of those investments are going to turn out, but the ones that do turn out are going to be relied upon to take us to net zero in the future. And again, that the scale of, when you think about it, more than 50% of that goal being filled by technologies that aren't yet developed really shows us how big this space is and how much we have to do. So I think, really to sum that up, Kim, I would say, more dollars invested in there from all parts of the economy, governments, industry, customers, that kind of thing.
So maybe
over to you.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in. People don't often think about the resource sector companies, including forestry companies, as being technology companies. And let's be clear, we're never going to be as sexy as Shopify or TikTok or Google. But the reality is that we are technology companies. We are the adopters. And without the issues to solve and the capital to spend on the innovation, a lot of the startups, the small, medium-sized companies that are scaling and commercializing wouldn't be there, nor the technologies. And I talked quite a bit earlier about some of the innovations and investments that's led to emissions reductions. And there's lots of other great examples that I didn't talk about earlier. Mosaic is electrifying its log trucks, for instance. But I think, and to Doug's point, it's the sense of urgency around this. We used to think about traditional infrastructure in terms of ports, railways, roads, and those are all still incredibly important. But when you think about where the rubber is going to hit the road in terms of the next big thing, it's really around AR, VR, it's around big data, AI, and what that could do for the resource sectors, including forestry, in terms of actually better being able to visualize this landscape, make better management decisions in terms of what we're doing in the forest. I'm better understanding what the impact of climate change is on the land base. And so if there's anything I could kind of leave this audience with, is that we actually do have to start thinking about some of those new technologies with the same sense of urgency as we used to think about, our traditional infrastructure.
Thanks. Dave, a question for you. What do you think is the one thing that BC could do to spur the right kind of industrial development without compromising our emissions targets?
Yeah, thanks for that. I've been thinking about that for a while and some of the work I'm currently doing. And if you could boil it down to one thing, it's the need to reconcile the number one instrument in the BC policy playbook right now in this space, which is the carbon tax, with the need to do offsetting and support the need for offsetting. Because where offsetting goes is into the space that Alexa's talking about. First Nations are very, very interested in this conversation about nature-based solutions. I think the environmentalists generally will be very supportive of some of these nature-based solutions ideas. But the problem is, how do you drive investment into those offsetting spaces when industry has to pay on their gross emissions as opposed to net emissions. So if we could come to a space where industry could say, like, whatever carbon tax is going to be today, $30 or $100 or $170, if I could take that money and invest it in nature-based solutions with this First Nations group, for example, that does a whole bunch of things. It's the same amount of money out of industry's pocket, but it goes straight to the ESG story that they want to be able to tell. Paying carbon tax doesn't help you at your annual general meeting, but boy, standing up with a First Nations group talking about what you've done for real, and this is where offsetting's got to be real. It's got, can't be a bunch of greenwashing, which quite frankly is happening out there right now in the world. Like, there's bad actors doing, things that are taking us in the wrong direction. But if you start to think about that, what it takes you to is also the voluntary markets. You've got Amazons of the world and Google and everybody, Walmart, talking about how they want to get to net zero. Well, how they're going to do it is partly through changing their behaviors, as we talked about earlier, but it's partly through offsetting. And they're doing those through voluntary markets. And those voluntary markets are going to happen whether BC plays or not. So the real question becomes, what should we be doing in our policy space to reconcile those things? Because I think it would be a virtuous way to spur a bunch of behaviors that everybody could support. The tricky part is, as you know, Kim is a former deputy minister of finance. That's not how our carbon tax works right now. And so that's a big, tough pill for the budget makers in BC. But again, it's all about kind of what do you want and how are you going to get there, and having those hard conversations.
Thanks, Dave. I think that's great. You touched on Indigenous interest in offsets and nature-based solutions, and it occurs to me, Alexa, that it'd be good for you to talk about what some of the existing benefits are and future opportunities for Indigenous peoples in the BC Low Carbon Advantage in forestry, domestically and for export.
For sure, and right off the bat, Indigenous communities are vital to the industry and their owners, their stewardship and business partners, contractors, suppliers, a huge employee base. There's 5,300 Indigenous people currently employed in the sector. So when you think about the massive opportunity I talked about earlier across the whole suite of opportunities on the product side, of course, this has got to be foremost the priority. We've got to focus on increasing Indigenous engagement across all facets of the sector and make sure that benefits continue to flow to communities. But again, I'd like to give you another example in the forest stewardship piece alone. There's a huge opportunity to build a shared path to climate resilience with Indigenous people. Science and traditional knowledge both point to the fact that Indigenous cultural burning, forest thinning, and managed wildfires help adapt forests to climate change and make them more resilient. So partnering with communities who know the land better than anyone else is both a huge opportunity from an environmental and climate perspective, but also from a jobs and economic opportunity perspective as well.
Thanks, Alexa. Doug, at the outset, when you were talking about marine fueling, I wanted to hear a little bit more from you about other low carbon alternatives like battery electric, ammonia, hydrogen, and how does LNG stack up?
Yeah, good question. There's obviously a range of solutions coming forward because energy use itself is not uniform, nor is the energy itself, for that matter. So it really opens the door for a number of different technologies and solutions to be used, and we're kind of seeing that come to the forefront now with a number of different options across transportation modes, for example. And so, maybe I'll touch on battery electric first. And, this is obviously the solution in light duty transportation. But when you think about a ocean going vessel, unfortunately, the technology just isn't there. There's not enough energy density, in vessels to bring them any meaningful distance across the ocean. So, I would say, though, that where you're looking at shorter haul, that's definitely a possibility. I know, for example, BC Ferries is one of the companies that are looking into this technology, and it has application in those maybe some of their shorter routes. But when we're talking marine shipping overseas, definitely not to the scale that it needs to be. Ammonia is interesting. There's lots of talk about ammonia these days. Of course, ammonia is made out of out of hydrogen and nitrogen. So it's an interesting energy carrier that doesn't contain any carbon. It's about half the energy density of LNG on a megajoule per liter basis. So, sufficient density. It's also a little bit easier to cool. So, you really only have to cool it to minus 33 instead of minus 160 to turn it into its liquid form. But like everything, there's pros and cons. The con with ammonia, of course, is that there are noxious emissions that are emitted that have to be dealt with when it's combusted, and it's also toxic when released. So another consideration when using it. Touching on hydrogen quickly, so we all know hydrogen can be made out of different things, green and blue and gray and those types of things. But I think a lot of talk today about hydrogen made from electricity and water, which is green hydrogen. And I think it presents some opportunities, maybe not in the short term in marine shipping. And that's its downside. Its upside is that it's low carbon, of course. But its downside is that it takes a lot more energy to cool it, because to turn into a liquid form with, to get it to an appropriate energy density, you have to cool it to minus 250 degrees Celsius. And then, even then when you're done, it has a lower energy density on a megajoule per liter basis than ammonia. Moving to LNG. So, LNG is an excellent energy carrier. As I mentioned earlier, downside compared to some of those other fuels is that it must be cooled to minus 160, but thankfully that technology is well developed. It has an energy density much closer to conventional fuels, and so it does contain carbon. But one of the advantages we have here in BC is that our LNG is 30% less carbon intensive than LNG produced around the world, and in relation to traditional fuels like marine bunkering oil, diesel. It is a further reduction in carbon emissions. The interesting thing about LNG as well is that natural gas can be a feedstock for blue hydrogen, and so while we may sort of ship the energy in the form of LNG, that doesn't mean that at the destination that it couldn't be converted into blue hydrogen and capture and store the carbon associated with it. So I think that's why today LNG is a proven technology, readily available. So it's got a lot of advantages over some of those other fuels that are still developing, and that's why we're seeing it adopted around the world. I would just say the last sort of maybe just technical, from a pure technical point, advantages is that the combustion of LNG or it becomes vaporized back into natural gas, is that it emits very, very little NOx, SOx, and particulate matter, which is very helpful on the local air quality side of things. So again, that's just maybe a quick passover of those different technologies, but I would say there's going to be room for each of them in the future, and that when I look at this question of what is going to be the maybe more short-term preeminent fuel in the LNG, in the shipping sector, I would say LNG, because of its sort of apparent advantages and the long sea shipping applications.
Thanks, Doug. Is there a message for policymakers in all of what you described in terms of helping enable this future?
Yeah, I think going back to this, it's really about keeping all of those options on the table, and I think from a policy perspective, we really have to resist the temptation to to pick a winner at this early stage. The reality is we're going to need all of these solutions to be successful, and as well new technologies in this space in order to get to that net zero future. So that's, I guess, the message I would give is, it's too early to pick winners. We need to put effort behind a number of different opportunities. And I think, here in BC, we have a significant advantage due to some of the factors, like the fact that we have a clean electricity grid, and our LNG is, at least at our Tilbury site, is made with clean renewable electricity, making it very low carbon compared to the rest of the world. So the second message is we need to take advantage of those opportunities to provide our low carbon advantage to the rest of the world.
Thanks, Doug. Dave, I'm going to go back to you. You brought up BC's carbon tax, and something I know we've been talking about for some time through the work with the Business Council is the fact that BC is the only jurisdiction in the world with an emissions trading system that doesn't have protection for emissions intensive trade exposed industries. And all the jurisdictions that we've looked at, and this was verified by MNP, they all have that policy in order to avoid the risk of carbon leakage. What is your view about that medium or long-term risk for carbon leakage for BC right now?
Thank you. And yeah, it's a great question. And it's something that most people don't think about, and we should, because it will undermine our economy if we don't get this policy frame right. And the point here is industries that are both emissions intensive and trade exposed. So think about our big industries that rely on exports, which is pretty much everything you can think of that is kind of core to our Canadian economy here. And those other jurisdictions you talked about, what drives me crazy sometimes is, you'll hear these jurisdictions say, well, their carbon tax is equivalent of $200. And I say, yeah, now go look at what that tax applies to. And you'll always find their heavy industries that I'm talking about are not on the list. Like they actually aren't taxed at all. Forget about $200. And why is that? Because no economy in their right mind is going to put those industries out of business. And that's what you do if you don't get this policy right, is eventually they move to jurisdictions that have better policies. And it's not because they're bad actor companies. It's because other jurisdictions have better policies in this space, and the policies are balanced in a way that makes sense. And the policies that can be brought to bear are wide and varied. The point is BC doesn't have one. Canada does, but BC doesn't. Canada has an output-based pricing system that recognizes exactly what we're talking about here. So the big question for BC is, what are you going to do in this space as you track to that, carbon tax federally going to $170? This is untenable. At $30, you can get away with it. At $170, you can't. So it's an open question, what's going to happen? And there's a lot of tools in the toolbox to tinker with this policy, and you're seeing it happen all over. This isn't unique to BC. Even jurisdictions that have good carbon tax regimes in Europe and elsewhere are really fussing with things called carbon border adjustments right now, because what they're seeing is, their jobs get exported because of what we're talking about, and then when they import finished products, they're trying to apply taxes to say, well, you don't have as high a tax regime in your carbon emission side, therefore we're going to tax the imports. That is a really difficult thing to get right. You've got Article 6 being talked about with internationally traded mitigation outcomes is going to be on the table again at Glasgow. So we'll see what happens there. So there's lots of tools in the toolkit that can help with this. But the thing that I'd just like to come back to is a lot of people will say, well, who cares? Like if we put those or if they go somewhere else, like, isn't that a good thing? Didn't BC just move towards its emissions targets by pushing those industries somewhere else? And isn't that actually a good thing for the BC targets? And first of all, we know emissions, are global, but the bigger thing that people need to start thinking more about is it's those industries that are paying the bills. And this has been studied and looked at, by the government. I worked there, I've seen the work. Those core heavy industries that we're talking about that are high emitting industries provide the foundation for this economy that we all enjoy here. They out of proportion pay the foundational costs of running our healthcare system, our education system, our social safety net, all those things. So boy, if you think pushing those companies out of BC is a good thing because of climate, you will regret it when those chickens come home to roost. And the last thing I'll say is, why are we having this debate anyways? That used to be the debate, and we used to all buy into it, and we got sucked into that. Well, I got to pick a side, because I'm either an environmentalist or I'm in favor of industry, so I got to be on a side. And I'll come back to what I said earlier. I don't think that's true anymore. I think the way that we're, if you look at what's going on around the net zero ideas, and all of these industries are talking about how to get to net zero. All of these industries have ESG imperatives that are really, pushing them in this direction anyways. There's those policy instruments that could be available to governments to help industry do where they want to go anyways is something everybody should be able to get on side with. Like, this is us getting alignment as opposed to opposition. And the icing on the cake here, which is the key thing to me, and it's becoming the key message, is First Nations need to be part of this story. And when you weave them into that narrative, you're finding First Nations across British Columbia that want in on these projects. They want to talk about the next mine or the next LNG facility or the next whatever, you know, and they are ready to step in a whole different way. And I'll tell you, ESG always gets, the narrative always gets sucked up by the E part, but I'll tell you, the social part is going to continue to grow in importance internationally. And just like right now, everybody wants to talk about your environmental bona fides, how you treat your local Indigenous population and what their story is, how they're participating in your story is going to be just as big as the E part before we're done here. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. I have a feeling that we could go on for a really long time. We can jump around to lots of different questions. We're almost out of time. Alexa, I'm going to give you the last 60 seconds here, because I know this is something that's really important to you. What do we need to do to strengthen BC's external brand as a low carbon natural resource product supplier?
Well, it's really funny, right? You think about the massive success Canada, BC's had in the past on the trade side, trade missions around the world with different industries hand in hand talking about being the partner of choice. Think about how powerful it would be if we did the same thing but focused on our low carbon and other ESG advantages. And that's really going to take being able to say out loud that we do it really well here in BC, and we have to do that in partnership. So, I mean, I think ultimately, if there's one big thing that we can do is actually work together with government, labor, First Nations, community, industries across the bat to say, what's our brand and what do we want to say to the world? We want to say that we're the partner of choice to, you know, impact investors, to consumers that are looking for better products that are good for the planet. That's where BC should be headed.
More BC benefits the world. Buy more BC. That's great, guys. Thanks. Tons of passion and energy on this topic, and also a lot of pride in British Columbia. And so thank you to the three of you. And I am pleased to now turn it over to Jeff Swag, who's the president and CEO of Mosaic Forest Management and chair of the Business Council of BC, to wrap us up.